Don't know if the name Thomas Boston means anything to you. Thomas Boston was a pastor in the borders of Scotland, in the little village of Ettrick, in amongst just all those border boroughs like Galashiels and Selkirk and Hawick and all those other places. He had a rural parish in the days when most of Scotland's population was rural. I think I'm right in saying there was about 50 or 60 people who took communion when he went there. By the time he'd finished, there were about 500, which is an extraordinary ministry. A very, very fruitful ministry. His famous book, Human Nature in its Fourfold State, became such a classic that I think they said there was a copy of that and Fox's Book of Martyrs in every household in Scotland. He had terrible tragedy, he and his wife. He and his wife had 10 children. 6 of those children died in infancy. Can you imagine? If you look his profile up on Wikipedia when you get home, it will list for you the names of all the children, and you can see when they were born and when they died. One of them lived to adulthood and became an admiral, but 6 of them died within a year. I'm guessing, but I assume they sort of got a chest infection in the cold of the borders, and that was what took them away. Imagine having to bury 6 of your own children. And struggling to come to terms with that tragedy, he wrote another book, which is a small Christian classic, The Crook in the Lot. And it's engaging with Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13. So maybe you want to have that open in front of you. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13 on page 556. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. Now, if you want to just keep a finger in there, flick back to chapter 1 and verse 15. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Thomas Boston talks about a crook. What is he talking about? He's not talking about a thief. He's not talking about a shepherd's crook. He's talking about something crooked. And that's why he's taking that out of this verse. We're not exactly sure, but I think that could be a weaving metaphor. Yeah, you have all these carefully spun threads, and they work their way from 2 directions into the loom, and they're woven together, but one of the threads bulks up. And you call that little sort of bulky bit of thread, that's the cotton that packs up, a slub. And when the slub has gone into the machine off the reel, and it's, the machine's going fast and it's in the fabric, you can see this slub in the fabric, and it sort of pulls the thread slightly, and it's uneven. Now, if you are a hippie, slub fabric is very popular, I can tell you. Having been in the rag trade in the 80s, that was very much the in thing for certain interior designers. And, if you go to Fabric Warehouse or whatever, you can probably buy slub fabric. But the point is, something sticks, something is wrong, something pulls the fabric slightly out of shape. Or if you want to go in another direction, think about carpentry. You cut a piece of wood with the grain and it's straight, but no piece of wood is ever completely the grain going all in one direction. And sometimes there's a knot or a branch or something, and so the grain goes off and you cut across the grain. And it doesn't turn out straight. The edge is rough or what have you. You're cutting across the grain. And there are some parts which come out crooked. And what has been made crooked can never be straightened out. And that's the idea that Boston has in mind as he reflects on Ecclesiastes 7, verse 13. Now, this is a huge thing for you and me to reflect on. Why is it that some things in our lives turn out the way that they do? Why does God allow suffering to come into our lives? Why are our plans frustrated when they were good plans? They were godly plans. We wanted to see God's name glorified in this particular enterprise. And so far as we could tell, it was all God's will, and we went at it, and then it floundered and collapsed. Why is it that other people seem to flourish while we experience frustration? Yeah? Why is it that life seems like a game of Monopoly and, all those other people, they are planting their hotels on Mayfair, which they own, while you get the card that says, return to go, do not collect £200. Yeah? Why is it that life is like that? Because Monopoly is only reflecting life, isn't it? More than that, when we encounter those crooks in our lives, how do we deal with them? How do we respond to them? How do we deal with pain and disappointment? What do our hearts do? What do our minds, our thoughts do? Do we turn the grief and frustration over and over and over in our minds like the beads on a rosary, continually going over it and over it and over it, repeating the pain of it and beating ourselves up for what we've done wrong, or getting angry with God for what he has brought into our lives? Or do we look for wisdom? Ecclesiastes is here to lead us towards wisdom. It will not give us all the answers. It will not get there. All the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are found in Christ, so we must not expect Ecclesiastes to give us all the answers, but it will get us some of the way. So we need to listen to these powerful words. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? First of all, consider the work of God. Consider the work of God. This work of God is carried out in his sovereign ruling of providence, of everything he provides for us. That's where the word providence comes from, isn't it? God is a good and kind creator. When he made the world, he made everything good. He looked at all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. We need to remind ourselves of those words sometimes, don't we? That sin was not part of the original design. Suffering was not part of the original design. All was straight and nothing was crooked. But Adam and Eve rejected God. Adam and Eve decided that they knew better than God. And so every kind of evil and rebellion entered the world. And as a consequence, God brings a curse on all of his creation, as recorded in Genesis 3. But here's the thing. Have you ever thought about this? When God put his curse on the world, he could have walked away. He could have just left the world to its own devices. He could have said, right, they've rebelled against me. Let them be left to themselves. One day he will do that to all those who reject him, because that's what hell is. Hell is people left to themselves for all eternity, in weeping and gnashing of teeth and so on. But actually, God did not walk away. His common grace still makes the sun shine and the rain fall, still keeps the earth turning so that we have day and night and seasons and years. He has still maintained his creation. He remains the sovereign ruler of his creation. And he's not just a God who's wound up the earth and set it going. He is in control of his creation. He provides for us in his providence. Ephesians 1 verse 11, he works all things according to the counsel of his will. And those words, all things, there's no exceptions to them. There's nothing that's outside of those two words. He works all things according to the counsel of his will. And everything which he brings into our lives, he brings for some hidden purpose. The secret things belong to God, says Deuteronomy. And that's absolutely right. We do not know why he brings these things into our lives. But we do know from Hebrews that he disciplines those he loves. That discipline and suffering is part of God's plan for us, part of our experience if we're Christians. Hebrews 12 verse 11. For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying it is the work of God that leaves some things straight and makes other things crooked in our lives. Now, Thomas Boston, who had had a lot of that to reflect on, he actually categorizes the crooked bits of life into 4 categories. First of all, there are natural crooks, natural crookedness. Some people are born with deformities, with bones that are not the right shape, with genetic abnormalities, with an extra chromosome, or with things that are damaged at birth, or what have you, or conditions that develop over time, inherited heart conditions, and it could be a physical abnormality, it could be a long-term mental illness like schizophrenia, or tragically for some families, diseases like Huntington's disease can run in the family, bringing the most terrible suffering. Or it could be another natural crook that often happens. People have a head injury and it leaves them with epilepsy. These are, if you like, natural crookednesses that come from being human. Then, says Boston, there are crooks of honour. That is, every human being is to be honoured as being made in God's image. We all have value. But some people seem to get the honour and some people seem to get the shame, don't they? Some people are pushed aside. Some people are slighted and ignored. Now, it may be that they're slighted and ignored because of something they've done. It may be that they've every reason to be ashamed, and that's why they've blighted their life by their behaviour. But some people haven't done wrong, and yet they are blighted with the most terrible suffering. Think of what is going on with Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe in Iran, and the things that she's suffering in prison, though she's done nothing wrong, being a pawn in an international power game. Then there are crooks of vocation, says Boston. People dedicate themselves to their calling, their career. That somebody sets up a business, but everything about that business fails. And they set up another business, and that fails again, a double bankruptcy sort of thing. Some people devote themselves to a lifetime of ministry as a pastor, but they never see anybody saved. And why is it that the friend that they trained with in college, they go off to another church and 50 people are saved, 100 people are saved over their ministry? Why is it that some people seem to encounter a life of peace and joy, and other people seem to have suffering after suffering? We have friends who were with us at uni who have gone through the most awful catalogue of suffering over the years that we have known them, the last 30 years or more. Then there are crooks of relationship. Thomas Boston and his wife married, they raised a family, and look at the grief that was brought into that family, the tragedy that they suffered. What father expects to bury 6 of his own children? Now, put all of that together. All that range of different circumstances, of different crookednesses. And here's the hard lesson to learn, and it's very painful. The preacher of Ecclesiastes says, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? It is a deeply humbling lesson to learn that we cannot straighten out the crooked parts of our lives. God has put that crook there, and God has done it. It is the work of God. That annoying circumstance, that daily pain, that inescapable grief that will never be undone in this life. And no matter how hard we try to change that situation, we fail. We wish we could undo our past behavior. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that we've done things in the past and we've seen the consequences of that, and we think, if only I hadn't said that. If only I hadn't sent that letter. If only I hadn't had that conversation. If only I hadn't driven down that road, or whatever it might be. And we wish we could undo that, but we can't. That's the point, isn't it? We wish we could have cemented that relationship, but it fell apart, and now we're alone. We wonder why it is that we've been born with a body that doesn't work as other people's bodies normally do. Why is it other people don't struggle with their mental health, but so many of us do? Why is it that we are continually passed over for promotion? We go to job interviews and it's always somebody else that gets the job, and we want to relive that interview again and again and again. It doesn't change it. Yeah? It's happened. It's gone. But we want to dwell on it. We want to try and relive the moments of that life-changing accident and think about what we might have done. And no matter how many times we do that in our minds, we cannot change the past. We cannot straighten out what God has made crooked. And the key principle at work here, the key spiritual lesson is this, isn't it? Will we surrender to the will of God? Will we surrender to the will of God? Will we allow God to be God in our lives? We have to submit to the truth that God has a plan for each of our lives. He is fashioning something different in each one of us. And we must trust him that what he has planned for us each individually is all wise. That there is a wisdom there that we cannot see because we are caught here in our human condition, and he is God. And he knows as only God can know. The book of Ecclesiastes is about seeking wisdom. And the book of Proverbs says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the battle that goes on in our hearts every day is this: am I going to be guided by my own wisdom, or am I going to be submitted to God's wisdom? Now you might say, well, what's the point of looking for wisdom in the book of Ecclesiastes? I cannot understand this book. It's so depressing. One of my minister friends said to me, Jim, the good news about Ecclesiastes is you don't have to preach on it. Which I thought was very odd. But there we are. I was actually preaching on it at the time, and I'd rather enjoyed it. We can shy away from this book and say, what on earth is it going on about? Well, this is a book about someone seeking wisdom. Lots of people say this is a book written by someone who's lost his faith. You know, this is Solomon after he'd had all those wives, and he's just completely beaten down by it all, and he's depressed about life, and it's just total depression. I dispute that. I don't know whether it's written by Solomon himself or somebody who never quite says he's Solomon. He says he's king in Israel, but he doesn't quite make clear who he is. But the fascinating thing about this book is that it's got different moods. It's a bit of a compilation. There are passages where he is observing, right? Making observations about life. Now, when he's making his observations, they are depressing. I grant you that. Yeah? I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. Yeah, that's depressing, isn't it? Those are his observations. And that's important because that's part of the striving to find wisdom. This depressing perspective on life drives us to want to find something better. But then there are other passages where he's giving us instruction. So, for example, just flip back a page to chapter 5. He says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, and so on. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, and so on. He's being very clear. He's instructing. He's telling you very clearly, and right at the end in chapter 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. He's giving advice to young people about how to live their lives. So there are these sections which are lifting us up. These are practical, positive instruction. And then there's a third category, and we're in one of those here in chapter 7. And these are the Proverbs. There are sections of Ecclesiastes which are rather like the book of Proverbs, where you have a statement and then you have another statement, and they're kind of parallel, and they're teaching us something together from two parallel statements. And here, the preacher's voice is especially confident. We don't know whether he wrote all these Proverbs himself or whether he gathered them. But this is certainly, I think, gathered wisdom that has been brought together. And chapter 7, verses 1 to 13 is one of those Proverbs sections. And I think the key to this list of Proverbs is to read the last one first. That doesn't sound very sort of obvious, does it? But if you get the big principle at the end, you'll understand what all the other Proverbs in chapter 7 are saying. So let's remember this great principle in verse 13. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? And let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. And I've really got two headings here for verses 1 to 12. The first heading is this: think about eternity in the house of mourning. Think about eternity in the house of mourning. Verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Don't we love to hear of a new baby being born? I met my great niece, little Heidi, a few weeks ago for the first time. I've got a few others that have been born to other nieces and nephews during lockdown, and I haven't met them yet. So I'm excited always to be called Great Uncle Jim yet again. How wonderful to go to a summer wedding. Yeah, a lovely summer wedding day. Hopefully the wedding day comes before the new baby, if you know what I mean. But there is something unique and special and spiritually valuable about a funeral, isn't there? It is better to go to the house of mourning, because there we'll do some solemn, wise reflecting on life and what it's for. We'll reflect on the life that's gone, and we'll also reflect on our own lives. We may not all have a wedding. Even if we do get married, we may not all give birth to a child. But we will all have a funeral, unless Jesus returns. We will all have a funeral, a time when the living can stop and reflect on this thing that the writer of Ecclesiastes, the preacher of Ecclesiastes, calls the breath of life. Life is vanity. It is a vapor. It's a breath. You breathe in and you breathe out on a cold day, and you see your breath, and you could almost get hold of it, and then it's gone. And that's the picture of your life in Ecclesiastes. You could almost get hold of it, and then it's very, very quickly gone. People don't want to talk about death, do they? Of course they don't. Because all they believe in is this life. They've written God out of the story. This life is all there is. And therefore we will mask death with euphemisms. Someone has passed. Someone has passed away. Someone has shuffled off this mortal coil. Someone has gone to a better place. Someone is no longer with us. Someone is always in our hearts. We walked through Harwell Cemetery this afternoon and saw the inscriptions on the benches and so on, and all the things that people write sentimentally about those who have departed. Why don't we want to talk about death? Because if you live your life without God, this life is all you've got. And death is, as it were, the final curtain. And you're not ready to meet God. And you kind of know that in your conscience, don't you? And therefore, you want to block that out. Because I've spent my life living without God. How dare I think about what is after death? And so wishful thinking takes over. What will people say at the end of your life? That's what the preacher here in Ecclesiastes is talking about, isn't it? To be sure, verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment. To get to the end of your life with a good name is a great thing. To still have friends. I've taken funerals of people who managed to lose all their friends during their life, and they were quiet and empty and hollow gatherings. Those who have served well, those who've built a reputation for humility and good character, they will be spoken well of at their funeral. But you know what? A good eulogy never gets you into heaven, never earns you eternal life. A genuinely Christian funeral is altogether different. It's a place of hope. It's a place where death is not the end of the story. And where the focus is not on what this person has done in this life, but on what God has done in them and what God has prepared for them in the life to come. What's the good news in your life? Is that good news going to last? What are the good things you're rejoicing in today? Are they going to last? The only lasting good news is found in Jesus, our Redeemer. And he has come to pay the price to set us free. God, by his favor, has sent his Son to pay the price of our sin and to bear the shame of our guilt that we cannot pay. And because he has died in our place, we can face that last day without fear. We do not have to face the fearful prospect of hell. Imagine dying and having to face judgment without ever having paid God any attention all your life, even though all the way along the way God was speaking to you. God was dropping hints to you. You had Christian friends. You nudged past a church time after time after time, and yet you never paid God any attention. And now there is only unending darkness, no escape. And someone will be paying the price, and it won't be a saviour. It will be you and me if we do not trust in Jesus. How do you deal with that prospect? Loads of people make a joke out of it, don't they? And that's what the writer, the preacher here in these verses draws attention to. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Some people say, do you know what? Hell is just an idea that medieval men invented to increase their power over people. I don't know if you've been watching Paul and Bob's Gone Fishing program. I've been rejoicing in some of the humour and the beauty and the gorgeousness of creation as they've been fishing by the river. But there was that episode where they met the local vicar, and that's what she said. Don't believe in hell. Just think it's a medieval idea. Strange, isn't it? All these medieval ideas that are 1,000 years old that Jesus talked about 2,000 years ago, isn't it? People say, have a laugh, sing a song, you've reached the end of your life, always look on the bright side of life, keep laughing, and all these inconvenient truths will just get brushed away. As the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. Actually, that's a sarcastic play on words there. Thorns crackling under a pot. Listen to the dried out briar burning away in the crackling fire. That's the kind of sense of the words. He's putting two words together that have that same sort of rhyme in the original Hebrew. Dry thorns make a lot of noise, but they don't give much heat. Yeah, when you cut a whole load of roses and let them dry out and put them on the bonfire, they'll blaze and crackle, and there won't be a great deal of heat. I remember digging up some ground elder and stashing it in a bucket, and all the ground elder roots dried up. And you can set light to them, and they burn like firecrackers. They're amazing, and they're gone very quickly. And then, the bucket hardly gets hot as the roots burn. That's what jokes are like at a funeral, they make a lot of noise. They make everybody laugh. But if you want to find a heart of wisdom at a funeral, by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. You'll be made glad to be thinking about eternity, not just looking back at time. And that's what brings us back to these words in verse 13. Consider the work of God. Consider the work of God. We are sinners in the hands of a holy God, and we so much need his redeeming grace. So let's go and learn in the house of mourning. That's the first thing. Secondly, from verse 7 to verse 12, think about time with a calm mind. If that's how you think about eternity in the house of mourning, think about time as well, but think about it with a calm mind. And you might read through verses 7 to 12 and think this is just a load of random connected proverbs that they've just been stuck in a list and they don't have much to do with each other. But I think there is a common factor in all of them, and it is this. They all concern our moods. They all concern our mental health, our state of mind. If we fret about the way that our lives have turned out, if we fret about what God has done to bring crooked things into our lives, our minds will fall into the sins of self-pity and escapism and anger and anxiety and fear. So here are some wise words about the thoughts that inhabit our minds. Verse 7, surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Well, that's a very timely verse, isn't it, for all that's been going on in Parliament this week. We see other people in power, and they're using that power to their own ends. And it drives some people mad, doesn't it? It really drives people mad. If my Twitter feed is anything to go by this week, some of my friends have had a lot to say, and maybe I have as well. When there is an injustice like that, when somebody has been shown up to be corrupt, people then start really going for them, don't they, and getting mad about it. And we fight against it, and we get annoyed about it, and we really start to get angry. And you know what? That fight consumes us, and it takes over us, and it takes all our energy, and it becomes the be-all and the end-all of our life. Sometimes, it is someone who's corrupt who's been found out, and people are appalled. Sometimes it's people who are accused of being, sleazy and so on, and they're fighting with everything they can to try and control things and be in charge of their lives. On the other hand, if we allow people to buy us off, what do we find? A bribe corrupts the heart. We can't live at peace with a compromise, can we? But here's the thing. We can learn that there are things in life, the way that other people treat us is crooked. You cannot explain it in any other way. But God has allowed that to happen. He has allowed for us to be exploited, to humble us. Oppression should drive us closer to God. And we should not fret about evil men, says the psalmist, because we know that they too will one day answer to God. Our God is in control, and we must trust him. Verse 8, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Have you ever thought about how pride is such a destructive thing in your mind, in your heart? It's the destructive pride that says, I must get my own way at all costs. Yeah? I know best. I understand the situation better than anybody else. And all the other people around me are fools. And it must be done my way. And the time to get it done is now, and we're going to do it my way. Have you ever thought like that? You ever had a family conversation around the table like that? Have you ever, had an argument in your marriage like that because you know that your way is best and you're just not listening? Pride is driving you. Consider the work of God and let that humble you. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. We try to straighten out everything that is crooked in our lives and have it our way, and we cannot. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? But if we wait upon the Lord, if we ask him for patience to accept what is happening in our lives, he will renew our strength and enable us to see it through to its end. In your mind, are you feeding your pride or are you developing patience? Verse 9, be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Now, when it comes to dealing with mental health problems, there are lots of dimensions to this. Some of us get depressed And we've written about this, some of us, and you'll be aware of the book that Steve Neal has been editing about pastors with a thorn in their side. Very often we're describing the situation of really low mood, of what I call a lead helmet, where you are so depressed that when you get up, you can hardly lift up your head. That's one side of mental health problems, that depression can be like that. But another side of it can be that as well as very low mood, you can have a very angry mood, that you've had a good rest and then you come back with too much energy and you want to sort everything out and you're driven by your pride and your own thoughts and your anger is very destructive in those situations. We can allow ourselves to become manically angry and our temper gets out of control. Now, there is a time to be angry. There's a time to be angry about injustice. There's a time to be angry at evil, isn't there? But remember that anger lodges in the bosom of a fool. It's a very picturesque description, isn't it? And when it lodges there, it burns and burns and burns, and it does lasting damage, and it wastes years of our lives, doesn't it? Be not quick in your spirit to become angry. Verse 10, say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Now, you know the old joke, don't you? Nostalgia isn't what it used to be, is it? But nostalgia is another part of the mind, isn't it? That we're always living in the past, yeah? We're nostalgically looking back, and it's a sign that we're not satisfied with our lot now. And as we get older, so the nostalgia gets stronger, doesn't it? Partly because our memories of childhood are rather stronger than our memories of last week. But it's a problem, isn't it? That we're always thinking that the good times were back there. And we're dreaming of a past age. Oh, do you remember when we had real phones where you used to dial the number? And we didn't have anything that, went off in your pocket and buzzed you. We didn't have the internet. Do you remember that? When we used to open the Encyclopedia Britannica and find it out for ourselves, and the computer never crashed because we didn't have one. That's just nostalgia, isn't it? And that's imagining that time in the past, and it's escapism. You will not find wisdom living that way. Brothers and sisters, God did not call us to be Victorians. If he wanted us to be Victorians, he would have seen to it that we were born in the 19th century, all right? Or even the late 18th century. He decided that you and I would live in the 21st century with our unique set of problems. God has put you here to serve him in all the troubles of this present time. That may seem crooked and strange, but who can make straight what he has made crooked? Finally, verse 11 and 12, these are slightly harder to translate. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, probably is better translated, wisdom is good as an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. If you're alive and you see the sun, well, praise God if he gives you wisdom. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. You've got money laid up as a pension for your future. Well, having wisdom to guide you is a bit like that, isn't it? And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Our society says if you've got money, you're okay. Yeah? The preacher says, no, what you need is wisdom. You really need wisdom. Wisdom means being submitted to the will of a sovereign God and having eternal life as your inheritance. Live your life under God. Consider the work of God. Let's draw this all together with the words of verse 14. Just that extra verse, which is not as such a proverb, but I think it's connected very powerfully. In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. I'm in danger of committing the sin of nostalgia in what I'm about to say, but it's August 2019. It's our daughter Megan's wedding day. And it's a gorgeous sunny morning. And David, who's now has married our other daughter. He's my son-in-law now. He and I went over to put the flowers out and various other things in the hall at Letcombe Regis. That beautiful village hall with the cricket green spreading up the hill. And it was a gorgeous sunny day. Abbey Chapel was filled with flowers and ladies in hats and men in suits and one or two in kilts and all the rest of it. And it was just gorgeous. The most gorgeous, lovely day. And I walked my daughter up the aisle. And then got the chance to preach as well. And then we had the reception, and after the reception, everybody spilled out onto the cricket field at dusk. 120 guests at a wedding. Do you remember that? None of us knew that day that 6 months later we would be plunged into a pandemic. And today, that sort of memory of that day feels so far away now, considering what we've come through since. Megan even did us the honour of making us some face masks as well. She was very useful. We never really knew why we needed a face mask back then. And the writer of Ecclesiastes says, God made the one as well as the other. The God who made that wonderful wedding day is the God who made the pandemic as well. So that man may not find out anything that will be after him. We don't know what comes next, do we? But we consider the work of God. And we rest in him. And we trust his wisdom. And we say, Lord, please take away my pride and my anger and my presumption. And please help me to accept what I have now from your hand. Both the things that are straight and the things that are crooked. And give me the grace to accept that I cannot make straight the things that are crooked. I must receive them as your work, the work of a wise and gracious Lord.